I want to thank you. Okay, meeting recording, good. Yeah, I want to thank you again, Mary, for agreeing to speak with our science student chapter this morning. Mary Silber is joining us from University of Chicago, and she's going to talk to us this morning about pattern formation, and in particular pattern formation in vegetation distribution in dry lands. So take it away whenever you're ready. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to see if this works here. I'm going to go to a full screen. I hope you all can see this well enough. Thanks so much for inviting me and giving me this opportunity. I always love invitations from student groups. So just saying that that's something I really like. And I'm going to talk about this pattern formation problem. I know you had another talk by my collaborator, Puneet Gandhi, so there'll be a little bit of overlap in how we present things, but I'm going to focus on some things that he didn't in his presentation. And what you're looking at here is, actually, I'll tell you how you get to this, but this is a satellite image from Google Maps of the distribution of vegetation in, I think it's in Somalia or Ethiopia, this particular, but in the Horn of Africa. And the dark bands that are somewhat regularly spaced is where the vegetation is, and the orange is bare soil. So these are in regions where there's not enough water to sustain uniform coverage of the vegetation, and instead it ends up just covering some fraction of the area, but it does it in this very regular fashion. So as somebody that works in pattern formation, I find it like really intriguing to think about this ecosystem strategy for deciding where to grow the plants. So if you want to see this, I'm just going to walk you through the steps that I use whenever I want to just pull this up in Google Maps. Is that I go to Ethiopia, I switch to satellite view, and I go to call it a triangle, but there's sort of this region that's between Ethiopia and Somalia that's kind of this very sharp triangle, and I go there and then I start zooming in, and this always works for me. These steps always work for me to find some gorgeous patterns. So if I do that here, you can see this is what I'm calling the triangle, where I put that star between that particular border, or looks like there's two borders that come together right there between Somalia and Ethiopia. And you see this amazing dendritic structure, but within each of these dendrites, you see these vegetation bands, and it's on a very large scale. Okay, so this particular slide I took from my collaborator, Sarah Imes, and it's her perspective on the arc of mathematical modeling. And so she sort of presents it like, oh, you have observations, and then there's models, and then you analyze the models, and then that suggests new observations, and then there's new models that emerge. I'm going to deviate a bit from this modeling cycle in some ways, because I feel like, maybe I can talk at the end about why I say I'm deviating slightly. It was the result of the curiosity of a particular graduate student that kind of made us think about the observations a little bit differently. And that's going to be a big focus of the talk, but I do at least want to hit on some of these modeling modifications just to let you know what we're doing recently. So I'm going to go back to an older paper from 2018, but I want to talk about current thoughts on modeling that we have. Okay, so these patterns occur in drylands, which are water limited ecosystems. So that's the limiting resource for them, and they cover a large fraction of the globe. Um, but it's not as if all drylands have these patterns. So there's some additional features that are needed. They tend to be hot regions as well. And I've circled, I want to show you some studies. I'm mainly going to focus on this region on the Horn of Africa, but I also want to tell you about a study done by another group that was in Sudan, so two places in Africa, and then the presentation that Puneet Gandhi made also involved looking at patterns in Texas and in Australia. Okay, so those are different examples where these occur. And part of the way that we know something about where this pattern formation happens is from this study by De Blauwe and collaborators. So this is I guess it's a Belgian group that has done a lot of really nice work looking at patterns and asking questions about what you can actually measure that's inspired by modeling efforts. And one of the studies that they did was that they took software, it was machine learning software that was developed around ecological niche. So sort of looking at, well, where have people reported this phenomena, and what are a bunch of variables associated with those regions, and can we make some predictions about where we might find additional examples. So their places to look are kind of that those brown regions on the globe. A lot of it is based off of where the observations were made, but they also discovered some new places. So in particular, this is another one of their figures. And so hopefully you can see this, that they have the brown on these. So it's showing this region in Africa, Australia, and North America. And the blue splotches are places that were already reported in the literature, and the green ones were new ones that they discovered as a result of their investigation. I circled this one in Sudan because that's one of the studies that I want to highlight here. So I do want to zoom in on this this location where that group ended up discovering some new patterns and carried out a study of that, which I like quite a bit. Just some more images. A lot of one thing we found really helpful, which is I think a bit unusual, is well, maybe it's not unusual, but I find it really helpful to go back to these really old papers that have no mathematics in them, but they just report on the phenomena and their on the ground observations or their aerial studies. So this is showing two different images from two different papers. One is the paper that's gets the attribution of being the first sort of publication on these patterns. That's the one on the left, and then another one from the 60s, just showing an on the ground photograph. And what I want to point out, or maybe I just point out one thing from the image on the right, where you see this woman standing near the edge of one of the bands. So you can see this very sharp boundary between vegetation and bare soil. And then the other thing I want to point out is that vegetation is, it's a mature community. There's grasses, there's shrubs, there's trees within that vegetation band. And what they say is that if you were on the ground, you would have no idea that there was this structure, and so the only way that they discovered it was by flying over the ground. And then they saw like, oh, wow, this is totally organized. And another thing that they pointed out was that if you were on the ground, it's actually quite flat. And so any elevation grade is really, really subtle. But then once you get up above the ground, you can use these vegetation bands to kind of determine what is the elevation grade, because the bands are oriented approximately perpendicular to the elevation contours. Okay, so just this quote from the introduction to this McFadden paper, that he points out that it must be studied, in the air, and that the underlying geology, wow, this is like cut off, isn't it? Oh, I see. Okay. The underlying solid geology seems to have no particular significance except in its molding the prerequisite geometry. So a couple of things I want to point out here, if you've never thought about pattern formation, is that the idea is that it could be something that just kind of spontaneously emerges. So it's not that it's sort of laid out. It's not like things were planted or there's terracing laid out for where the plant should grow. That's something that just kind of emerges as a strategy used by the ecosystem. So that statement, even though that paper has no mathematics and they're not thinking about pattern formation, it has a lot of the flavor of how we think about it today as an active area of research. And then the other important thing is this observation that it needs to be studied from the air. And a lot of what I'm going to focus on in my talk today is how satellite images have helped people to really gather a lot more information on this phenomena. Okay, so I want to switch slightly what I'm talking about, because I feel like this is, I often think that this is kind of a weird topic to be studying, I want to just go back to like, how did I come to be investigating this and what drew me to it? And I'm thinking about how, students maybe like wonder, like, how do people choose research problems? Like, how do you end up deciding what to work on? And so I want to just mention some of the papers that I was intrigued by that got me sort of drawn into this topic. I don't know if it was 10 years ago that I started working on it, but probably maybe not quite 10 years ago. But and so one of them came from this particular paper. This was a paper in Science. It was kind of a opinion piece or something from this group of ecologists in the Netherlands, who put forth this idea that maybe the morphology of the patterns might tell you something about how close you are to some kind of catastrophic tipping point. So in this graph that I'm showing, which is just schematic, it's not from models, but it's sort of their picture of how this would work, is that you have some resource on the horizontal. So in the case of these dryland vegetation patterns, that resource is the amount of water coming into the system. So something like the mean annual precipitation in that region. And on the vertical is some measure of how robust or how active the ecosystem is. And if you were to start at a lot of, plenty of water input, you could sustain uniform coverage of the landscape with vegetation. But as you decrease that, there's an insufficient amount of water. And so what they were seeing in their models is that what ends up happening is that decreases is that you end up getting some holes in the pattern. So there's the pattern shown here, the dark is vegetation and the light is bare soil. And so you see that it develops some holes. So that's what they call the gap pattern. There's like gaps in the vegetation. If you decrease further that resource, those holes end up kind of growing in size and merging, and you get to this kind of labyrinthine structure. And then if you decrease it even further, the labyrinth breaks up and you have this spot pattern. So they were saying that, okay, it goes through this sequence, and they saw this in multiple models of different types of ecosystems where it had this well-defined sequence of patterns that occurred prior to the complete collapse. So they wanted to put it forth as a kind of early warning sign that there's something there within that. Here's another paper. It had a similar story where they were using the patterns to classify the aridity level of the region. They had a completely different model, and yet they saw the exact same sequence. Okay, so that as the resource or the precipitation here decreased, it went from gaps to labyrinths to spots. And here's yet another one. Okay, so this was a completely different model, same story. Okay, so here I want you to focus on, there's two parameters within this. This is from this Belgian group. They have a aridity parameter on the horizontal, and then they're thinking about the slope of the terrain on the vertical. So if it's a flat terrain, they got that as the aridity increased, they went from the gaps to labyrinths to spots in a completely different model. So here, 3 different models, 3 different groups, and they're seeing this exact same sequence. So that's something that really drew me into this. So here it is within, different images showing these, and then also within these, within a mathematical model. And what I was thinking it looked like, and other people thought about this as well, is that these spot and gap patterns look like they're approximately on some kind of hexagonal lattice. So I'm calling one of them down hexagons and one up hexagons, and I'll explain that terminology in a minute. And that the labyrinthine pattern, I'm thinking of it as some kind of distorted stripe pattern. And so one of the early papers that I read as a graduate student, my advisor was Edgar Knobloch. So this was an early paper I read, and it was about symmetry breaking in Rayleigh-Benard convection. So in Rayleigh-Benard convection, you have a layer of fluid heated from below. And what they show from this kind of at putting together bifurcation theory with group theory, so that's equivariant bifurcation theory, that the symmetry breaking bifurcation, where the uniform state that's fully symmetric becomes unstable and creates the patterns, that generically what you expect are 3 different solution branches to come out of that bifurcation. One of them is what I'm calling and what they call the up hexagons, one is the down hexagons, and one is the convection roll pattern. So that's what I'm calling the stripe pattern. So if I go back to these, it seems to me that these just sort of match up very nicely with these classic patterns from fluid dynamics. And just to comment on these up hexagons versus down hexagons, it has to do with whether the fluid is flowing up in the center of the hexagon, so that's the up hexagon, or is it flowing down in the center of the hexagon, and that's the down hexagon. Okay, so that was a point of contact between these pattern formation studies, early warning signs, and things I knew from studying pattern formation in fluids. And so we wrote a couple of papers related to this, and I don't want to go into those, I guess, but so I guess I've been working on this from around 2014. But at any rate, we did some studies looking at what in a bifurcation setting would lead to this particular sequence of transitions. And then we investigated it within one of these models, just because we found that in order to get that sequence, I need certain conditions, additional conditions to be satisfied. And so what we did in the subsequent paper is that we showed that those were satisfied for kind of robust reasons within these models. Okay, so that's just some history. And I think when I first started out in this area, I found it challenging for the reasons I want to indicate here, because I was coming from studying patterns in fluid mechanics, so what I'm calling the wetlands, and I'm trying to switch over to studying these patterns in this ecological setting. And so I just want to contrast these and indicate, all the challenges that kind of hit me with this. If I sort of go through, well, in the case of fluid mechanics, we know the equations. And in the case of these vegetation patterns, there's a bunch of models out there of varying complexity, but it's not like there are experiments to validate them. Okay, so that's a challenge. Parameters for these fluids, they have really good specs on all of that. They buy their fluids from a particular place. They know exactly what the viscosity is. There's tabletop experiments. Sometimes the timescales of these can be quite short versus really long ones. And I had this, I just want to contrast here. This was one system that I worked on for a long time with these Faraday waves. So this is where you have a layer of fluid and you shake it up and down and you form patterns on the surface. So this is just sort of indicating like, okay, we know the frequencies for this vibration, which sets kind of time scales, is measured in hertz, tens of hertz, 100 hertz. The experiment reports, they have these fluids sitting on this aluminum plate and they know exactly its diameter and they have it, it's like machined to be incredibly flat. They know the density of the fluid, they know the surface tension, they're quoting those to 2 or 3 significant digits. The viscosity may vary, but they can control it with the temperature. They can run the experiment at this, completely stable fluid temperature, and so that there isn't much variation within this viscosity. So it's just like beautifully controlled. And then I'm trying to switch over to doing something where I'm losing all of those points of contact. I don't know the equations. I don't know the parameters. The time scales are super long. The length scales are long, which is an advantage because then you can do these satellite images to get some stuff. And even if one thinks about the mechanisms for the pattern formation, those are sort of well developed and validated in that fluid setting. And so we have some proposals on the mechanisms that I believe, but and then I've circled this opportunity presented by heterogeneities. The heterogeneities are a problem, but I'm trying to turn it into, maybe there's something good about that. Maybe it gives you a bit more information because it is heterogeneous environments. Okay, I want to say a little bit about the modeling, and in particular, just focus for a second on one of these really influential models. So this was a model by Klausmeier, who's an ecologist. It appeared in, I don't know what that says, 2000. Sorry, I'm cutting off my, let me just fix this because I can't. I need to collapse this so I can see. Okay, so it was this paper in 1999 of Klausmeier's, where he reports on this phenomena and puts forth a really simple model. So it's a model in terms of a pair of partial differential equations. One of them is for is W, which represents water, and I put it in quotes. So it's some kind of water field. And then there's another field that it's interacting with, which is the biomass field. So some kind of biomass density. And it's a super simple equation. It's got a single nonlinearity, which is meant to capture a positive feedback between the vegetation and the water resource. And it gives these patterns, and you can tune parameters easily to get it so that they're on the right kind of length scale and investigate some things. Okay, so I want to just, there's a bunch of models, even more now. This is like an old slide. There's tons of models at this point. But there was some analysis done of this Klaus-Meyer model by some mathematicians. So this is coming from Arjen Dolman's group. And suddenly they call this model the Klaus-Meyer Gray-Scott model. So I want to show you the Gray-Scott model. And here I'm showing you an old paper that appeared in Science that I remember when this paper came out. And it came out in 1993. And it just is a gorgeous paper that's gorgeous in the sense that it has these beautiful patterns that I'm showing here. And basically what the paper is trying to get at is that you have these very simple equations and just this incredible richness of patterns that can emerge from it. Okay, so that this Gray-Scott model is kind of a made up chemical reaction. And you can write down the kinetics of this, and then you could add in diffusion of the chemical species, and depending on parameters, you can get this huge diversity of patterns. So I bring this up because it's not surprising that Klaus-Meyer could develop a model that has a lot of similarities to this one and produce patterns that look like what you see in nature. And so I don't think that's a great proof of concept, because we know that we know how to develop these patterns. And in fact, if you go from Klaus-Meyer's model, you can make a transformation to turn it, at least the kinetics part of it, into the Gray-Scott model. Although one of the parameters which has to be positive in Gray-Scott is negative in Klaus-Meyer. And then another difference is that for Klaus-Meyer, he's thinking of the water transport on a hill slope. And so there's an advective term that's is how the transport happens for the water field, whereas in this chemical setting, it's diffusion. Okay. So what I want to do now is turn to observations. And in particular, I want to go back to this paper that I showed earlier about the different patterns. And I was just mentioning it as if it were a modeling study, but in fact, it's an observational one. So this is about this study in this region in Sudan. Okay, so the model has at high aridity, you have this bare soil desert state, and at low aridity, you have uniform vegetation, and then you go through these sequence of patterns depending on how sloped the terrain is. So for flat terrains, it goes through what I was calling the gaps to labyrinths to spots. And then if it's sloped, then there's a preferred direction, and you end up getting these vegetation bands that are oriented perpendicular to the slope. Okay, and so what they did in this study is that they went to this region in Sudan where there's a huge aridity gradient. So it's in this region of the Sahel, and you go from the sort of most arid part where you have, say, here this contour in this top plot of it is 200 millimeters of rain per year. That's really like a desert. But that as you move down in latitude, you get the amount of mean annual rain increases. So it's going from 200 to 600. Okay, and you can see that in that plot of Africa, that it's the sort of going from brown region to a green region. And so what they did was they looked in this region and they built a classifier for the patterns. Okay, so they took all of these little tiny grid cells that are really small, and then had them classified according to whether they were spots, labyrinths, gaps, or bands. Okay. And so here, and the interesting thing about this is that they were able to detect this, that as it became more arid, it went from the gaps. Okay. So in the wetter regions, you get the gap pattern, and then it goes to the less wet regions and they see the labyrinths. And then if they go to the really dry regions, they see the spots. So this is some confirmation of this. It's not of this proposal. And this is really one of the few that I've seen. A lot of the people are sort of saying like, oh, okay, it's going to go through this well-defined sequence, or basing that off of models. But here's something that was based off of observations, which I really like. Um, and then they also see these band patterns. So that's what they're coloring in red. And one thing I want to point out here, there's this little tiny rectangle by the letter E. Okay, so I'm zooming in on that. This is a figure from their paper. And what they've done is sort of showed that rectangle labeled according to whether it's bands, gaps, or bands here. And then they also took that strip of the image and combined it with topographic data. So they sort of, put in a third axis, which is the elevation. And the thing I want to point out is that you get these flat terrain patterns, the gaps in that region where that strip of land is really flat, and you see the bands in the regions where it's sloped, but the slopes are really modest. If you look at this, that strip is 6 kilometers in length, and if you look on in the vertical, it's measuring the elevation in meters, and it's going from, I don't know, 480 something up to 490 something. So just like 10 meters variation over 6,000 meters. So these slopes that lead to the slope terrain patterns are really, really modest. So in our investigations, we usually put in that it's like a 0.5% grade. Okay, so I want to show you a particular study that we did related to this, and I'm going to go to this region in Somalia that people had pointed out. There are a lot of these studies. There's even more now. This is an old slide, but I want to show you what we did related to this. And this is work of a PhD student who was really great to work with. And in fact, I still see him because now he's living in Hyde Park in Chicago, in the same neighborhood as me. So the interesting thing about Karna was that he did his PhD when I was at Northwestern in applied math. So he's an applied mathematician by training, but he really approached it as somebody who was in love with the science. Okay, so on that, like if you think of applied mathematicians, they might be at one end really in love with the mathematics and want to really develop that. And then maybe at another end of that spectrum, they're really in love with the scientific questions that they can address using mathematics. So Karna was very much on the science end of that. And he really just wanted, and he was the student who did that work on the early warning sign transition. So he did a couple of papers related to that. And then he just really wanted to understand what could people actually measure. Like rather than say like, here's a model and it suggests this sequence, if we were really to take to heart this idea that you could monitor the ecosystem remotely through the images, what could you detect? Okay, so so he went to this region in Somalia that has a lot of these patterns. So here's one of these early photographs of it from 1945 from this McFadden paper. Here's another one from that McFadden paper, and in the map that they gave in that paper, the sort of like beautiful old school hand-drawn map of Somalia and Ethiopia. And what Karna realized was that he could open up Google Maps and he could find the exact same image. So he could match it. Just going to this map that they provided, he knew roughly where this pattern was. And so he opened up Google Maps and found that he could perfectly match it. I was so happy the day this happened, because I didn't realize that it was so easy to not just find the patterns, but find the exact same locations as they were reported in those early papers. So this is from a paper we wrote with Sarah Imes, who was a postdoc with me at Northwestern at this time that Karna was doing his PhD. And so this is a map showing that region in Horn of Africa. And on the right, these little quadrilaterals that are in blue or red are Karna's matching between two different sets of aerial images, which he ordered. One is from the US, I forget, Armed Air Force or something from 1945. So that's from some US investigation of this region or survey of this region of Africa. And then there were these red ones, which are from the Royal Air Force. And these are the locations that are reported in these early papers from the 50s and 60s. Okay, so those are exactly the location. So that there's the little, that little square is that image, and this odd shaped region is this other one. And I just want to point out that, this photograph is taken at an angle. Okay, so you can actually figure out which direction they're looking from that, the shape of that quadrilateral. Okay, so you're looking off at a horizon, and so that's why on one edge it becomes really large, and at the other edge it's narrow for that. Okay, here's yet another one. And so what he did, and this is where it sort of deviated from anything he had done as part of his training within, the kinds of things that I do, which was these sort of pattern forming PDEs. So he gathered the photographs, and he also got high quality satellite images from the 60s. So he's got like two data sets from these old photographs from the 50s and the 60s. And then he also acquired some modern satellite images by writing to this Digital Globe Foundation that collects these for places like Google Maps. And they gave him what they called a grant, which was that they gave him some of these. So he tracked down these images. And then the other data source that he was interested in was the elevation data. So that's available. So this is also just showing elevation data. So he wanted to combine these old images with modern images with satellite data for a number of locations. And then what he did was he aligned these images. Okay, so he had these pairs of images and he would click on the exact same thing. Turns out the bands of vegetation move, and that's known. So you can't click on the vegetation bands. You have to click on some kind of geological feature or click on a tree or something. So he'd match these, and then he would do the transformation to align the two images. So if you think of it that you have like a satellite image, you're looking straight down, but these aerial photographs are looking at a weird angle, and you sort of want to take that aerial photograph and distort it so that it's as if you're looking straight down. So you need to sort of map the corners to the corners. And so he did this with matching at least 10 points. And okay, so here, can you guys see this moving? I hope you can. This is a movie. This is,
Yeah.
remember I said that he had three different data sets. So one is the modern one is from the 60s, and one is from the maybe 50. And this is just a movie where he's showing just how well he does with this alignment. And you can see the evolution of these vegetation bands, at an individual level. Okay, so he spent a lot of time just sort of staring at these, trying to see, well, what change can I see? What is possible? What could I detect? And actually, it's like pretty robust, that there was not a lot of change in this particular one. And here is a false color overlay of the 1952 image and the 2006 image. And this is a quote from this old paper by Hemming, who was studying this on the ground and who observed that, in fact, the bands were moving, that there was upslope colonization going on. And so he made some measurements and some projections that the bands would move one arc width in 60 to 120 years. And that's pretty accurate for at least for these particular images. So they are sort of slowly moving uphill, and other people have made that observation as well. And not just these, yeah. At any rate, that's like almost considered a fact that these vegetation bands are moving very slowly. And the mechanism for that, I believe, is pretty well understood. You have this contrast in how the water infiltrates into the soil, depending on whether it's bare soil, where there can be a soil crust and the water just sort of slides over the bare soil and doesn't infiltrate very much. But then once it gets to the vegetation band, it slows down and can infiltrate more easily. So the regions that you have vegetation end up having high infiltration, and the regions where you don't have vegetation have low infiltration. So that's a positive feedback that reinforces this. And because the water's flowing in some direction, it sort of preferentially will be deposited at the leading edge of the vegetation band and feed that more than the trailing edge. And so you get this sort of gradual migration of the bands uphill. Okay, so what Karna ended up doing was taking 9 of these images that he obtained from 2 different regions in Somalia, and he just wanted to look at, like, what's changed, what can I see in these 9 images that are carefully aligned. And he ended up trying a lot of things, trying to automate this, and in the end he ended up doing, in large part, a visual analysis of it. The guy has like an amazing eye, so he was able to do this. He had some, he had the elevation data, but he would just sort of click through these 9 images in a grid and make observations about the bands. Okay, like, did they change at all? And then also anything else. I think one of the things that he really started seeing was that in some of these regions, there was signs of human impacts, like there were more tracks through the landscape. So he calls it road development here. And basically, if you look at these 9 images, there were 4 of them where there was substantial signs of human impacts. So formation of settlements or these tracks through the landscapes, and the remaining 5 had very little of that. So they were pretty pristine and didn't look like there were a lot of humans in, rampaging across that landscape or settling there. And then the other thing he was looking at was, well, how robust are the bands? Is there any change in the bands? So here's an example where the bands completely disappeared. You can see some faint ghost of the bands in that image on the right, and you can see the tracks through the landscape. Okay, and so basically the regions where he saw the band degradation were exactly in the exact same 4 locations. So these red squares and yellow squares saw like complete degradation or partial degradation of the vegetation in those regions. And these green ones, like SP5, it's like completely green. And that just means like, oh, the old image and the new image look pretty much the same. So SP5 and these 4 Howd ones, 1 through 4, you know, there's no change in the vegetation. You know, so here's some more examples from that paper, just showing the degradation and the signs of human impacts in this settlement here. And so I just want to say, like, what I found interesting here was he was really trying to say, like, okay, if I want to do early warning signs, or I want to look at impacts on this vegetation, what can I measure? And the thing that came out of it was not about changes in the amount of rainfall, but changes in the human activities in those regions, which is another way that you can get desertification, but it's not in the models. You know, so he could measure individual bands. There were other interesting things within this, but study. But let me. Yeah. So yeah, I could talk too much about this, and so I'm going to just move ahead. I just want to point out this as sort of an interesting example of a student following his nose with, you know, just wanting to understand the science of it, of the problem, and not worrying so much whether he was going to be doing novel mathematics. And the interesting thing about him is that he is now working in a microbial ecology lab, designing and building his own experiments. So he's become a scientist in the sense of, you know, working in a laboratory, designing experiments. So he really pivoted from what he was trained in a way that's cool. Okay, so I just want to finish up by going back to model studies. So just to summarize from this analyzing these satellite images, it's, you know, he demonstrated that it's possible to track the dynamics of individual vegetation bands over that 50-year period, but although only sparse data points early on, and that he found that the biggest impact in this region is likely due to changes in human land use. And one of the things I didn't say is that some of that ended up being kind of counterintuitive, and none of this is in the models. And then the other thing I always have to remind myself of, because I work in dynamical systems, and a lot of the focus of dynamical systems is on asymptotic dynamics, sort of like what can we say about asymptotic behavior. And I don't know if these observations, what I'm seeing is of transience, you know. So some of these counterintuitive things may make sense if we're just looking at a transient state. And so just to finish up, one of the things that we decided to do was, rather than trying to study things over time, which is hard, maybe to study it over space, looking at different realizations of this. So this is in the spirit of that Sudan study, where they said, okay, let's just, rather than saying like the system evolves at one location between different patterns, let's look at different locations and see if we could see some evidence for these different patterns. And here it's just, I want to advertise the presentation that was given by Puneet Gandhi to you, where he was focusing on the arcing of these patterns. And the sense in which, so these individual bands are arced, and at least in these early studies, they say, okay, they're arced, so they're convex upslope. So you can look at the arcs, they're perpendicular to the elevation grade, and you can figure out what is uphill by looking at their curvature. And so we ended up going and looking at 3 different locations, not just in the Horn of Africa, but also in Australia and in Texas, each of which has different aridity levels, and looking at these arcing of the bands and trying to determine whether the vegetation bands are following contours of elevation or not. And we couldn't get a good match to say like, oh yeah, we're just seeing, we're looking down on the landscape and we're seeing the elevation contours, that the bands are a contour map of elevation, but they definitely had some orientation depending on where they were on the landscape. So just telling you that I went to your YouTube channel yesterday and I saw that you have this talk by my collaborator Puni Gandhi that's exactly on this. So the fact that you have it there, if you are interested in this topic, you could, and missed his talk or want to refresh it, that's available to you. And so the takeaways that we had from that study were that at least in the regions we were looking at, the arcing was due to topography, and the curvature of the bands were the same as the curvature of the contours, and it's not a case of some kind of spontaneous arcing on a uniform hill slope. And we came away with this idea that if you have concave upslope bands in valleys, those are going to be more vulnerable to collapse than the convex downslope bands on ridges. So we found that it was really attractive to kind of combine these satellite images with elevation data. So this idea that the bands may tell us something about how close we are to a collapse of the ecosystem, that might be a factor to include. And one of the things that came out of that investigation was that if we really want to look at the influence of topography, we really need to be doing a better job of investigating the surface water transport. So I just want to mention 2 recent studies of ours in this sort of modified models setting. I've told you about this study on the arcing that was Gandhi, but there are 2 other papers I want to just mention, and actually one of them is just work in prep, so I can't tell you a whole lot about it. But this is going back to one of these early studies, and they describe how he's on the ground, this guy Hemming from the Anti-Locust Research Center, is on the ground studying this, and says that when there's a rain event, the rain runs off as sheet flow. So you have a big storm, the rain sort of coming across the bare soil in a big sheet, bringing with it plant litter and animal excreta, and it deposits that where the sheet flow gets arrested at the edge of the vegetation band. Okay, so we wanted to bring in some of this, but it means trying to resolve the timescales of rain events. And typically these reaction diffusion models are really meant to be focused on the biomass, which is the thing you can observe. It's hard to observe the water or the soil moisture. We just don't have access to that data. So we built this fast slow model working with a couple of ecohydrologists, Milcray Preparato and Sarah Benetti. And the idea was to build a model that has sort of a fast system which acts during a rain event, that's just looking at the surface water and how that gets infiltrated into the soil, keeping the biomass frozen. And then once the storm is over and the water is infiltrated into the soil, we then evolve the biomass with the soil moisture in a model that's kind of akin to that Klausmeier model. And then when a new rain event comes, then we repeat this procedure. So that was that study. And then the last study, which is I want to mention, which is something we're doing right now. We're writing this up over the summer. was that we really wanted to get to this other aspect of drylands. So the drylands were defined by this, at some point, somebody tried to define them. And one of their things was not just that they were water limited, but that the rain that did come in was infrequent, discrete, and largely unpredictable. So what we're working on now, and this is uh, again with this close collaboration with Puneet and with the undergraduate Lily Liu, or actually she's graduated. She just graduated. Lily, a former undergraduate from University of Chicago, has been working with us the last couple of years trying to develop a model to put in stochastic rain input. And so we're really interested in doing that, like just saying like, okay, maybe we have these rain pulses. There's some randomness to their timing and intensity. And we're interested in how characteristics of that might influence the collapse of the ecosystem. So just keep the same mean annual precipitation, like the mean is the same, but what if we change how variable those rainstorms are? So that would be another type of climate change that could happen. It's not that we change how arid the region is, but just by the distribution of the rain events. So that's a project we're doing right now and that I'm excited about. So I just want to say that I've benefited from working with these just really fun people, and they're really adventurous. I have so much admiration for Karna that he just has become a microbial ecologist. He's just so adventurous going out and looking at this data. Sarah Imes was a former postdoc. Puneet was a former postdoc. So but I held on to them. I still like talk to all these people all the time. So I guess that's a message that I have, that when you have like great collaborators and great friends, you want to keep in touch with them. And then we also benefited in this projects I'm talking about with some former students, Luke Werner and Lily Yu, who I worked with before they started PhDs programs, and then Sarah and Emil Ray, who were these eco-hydrologists who were really generous about talking with us about how to do the modeling of the overland flow and the water infiltration in a way that hydrologists would recognize it, and told us how to pick parameters and the like. So I can take any questions, or I seem to have used the full hour.
No, that's great. Thank you so much. Great talk. Let's give Mary a round of applause, either with your icons or unmute yourself.
Thank you.
Yeah, so we have time, I think, for a couple of questions if there are any.
I'm seeing something.
Yeah, there's one in the chat right now.
Yeah, does this pattern studies help to prevent or predict potential? I think that is what one would hope, is that you could use these kind of studies to suggest, like, are there like land management strategies that might be informed by that? And one of the things we're thinking about is like, how could changes in, like features of the rain input how that might lead to collapse. But I feel like there's a big gap between what we're doing and what might be practical. But I'm kind of conservative. I'm like a conservative mathematician that doesn't want to overclaim things. There are other people that will claim otherwise, but they're probably better funded than me. But yeah, I think I see it more of a, kind of something that inspires me, but I'm also content to just study this because it's beautiful.
Any other questions? I had a question about the point you raised concerning the transient dynamics, or the possibility that what you're seeing is
Right.
transient dynamic. Presumably models could be used to inform that question.
Right.
Do any or all of these models that you discussed today support transient dynamics of that type, where you're seeing these banding patterns move, or would that require additional mechanisms to be explored?
I want to just point out one image in particular. So it is definitely the case that the models, yeah, actually the simplest models are the easiest to analyze for that traveling, because what the people do is they look at these bands as kind of traveling waves, traveling periodic waves, and you can get a travel speed out of that, and that's a very natural thing to do. What I think is harder to, so that is good. Things like the spacing of the bands, I think, is also something that is predictive out of these models. I think what people have not focused on, or that I'm not familiar with them focusing on, is the width of the band. So I think that is actually quite interesting. So in this, I don't know if I have, like, one of the things that Karna did is he kind of automated getting these transects so he could get some kind of profile of the band, so you could get their width. And the thing that was counterintuitive is that he found that in these vulnerable regions where he saw collapse, the bands seem to have widened. So you'd think, oh, this is a disrupted landscape, and if it's widened, it sounds like there's more biomass. But this is one of these images. Here's the 1952 one, showing a bunch of slices through a band. So he's got a bunch of these. 1967. In 2011, it looked like it got a lot wider. The thing that we wondered about is, are we about to see a splitting event? So that's the thing that I just feel like, okay, I don't know, is it widening, or am I just in the middle of a band splitting event where this single band is going to divide into two for some reason? Because that is a kind of thing that people would be interested in, because it's a change in the wavelength if you somehow insert an additional band. So yeah, it's more that thing about the transient is just sort of like note to self, some things are transients out there, and because I was trained to think about bifurcations and things that are kind of like, these are hard systems to study, so let's at least try to see if we can get to the steady states. We might not be seeing that, so yeah.
Sure, thank you. Any other questions? Okay, well, let's thank Mary again.